Welcome back, or hello if you're new here. Today I'm going to be talking about science fiction fantasy books that I've read recently, which includes some of the best fantasy I've read all year, which was published this year, as well as some science fiction, well, that didn't turn out as well. So I have some great books to talk about, some that I'd rather forget about, and let's get started. First, let's talk about the good, which is mostly fantasy, and that is He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan. This is the second book in a duology that starts with this book here, which is She Who Became the Sun, one of my favorite books the year that it was published, and I've been very eagerly waiting this conclusion here. So as I mentioned, it's a duology, which is fantastic because it does not suffer from middle book syndrome. If you're not familiar, I'll give you the synopsis of book one. This is a book set in historical China where we follow a young girl who is destined to be a nobody. She, at the beginning of the story, is with her father and brother. They are starving, and her father really treats her like nothing. They go to a fortune teller at the beginning and find out that her brother is meant to do amazing things. And again, she is a woman and therefore she has no future. However, something horrible happens at the beginning of the story, right at the start, so I'm not spoiling anything as part of the synopsis, which changes their destiny. And so she takes on the role of her brother. She pretends to be him and goes to this monastery to train and take on his role. And then she basically goes on to try to fulfill his destiny. This, as I mentioned, is set in a historical time period of China where there is Mongol influence or control over their area. And so we follow her in her early years as more of a coming of age story at the beginning, and then later on it moves into more of a military story as she moves her way up the ranks under the disguise of being her brother, and then begins to have more pull. And so there's a lot of strategy in the later parts of the book. I've often described the first book as being a combination of the Poppy Wars with perhaps a slightly more likable character than Ren, as well as it has the military or large scope historical politics and war efforts of the Dandelion Dynasty. So if you enjoyed those books, I highly recommend this series. So that is just a setup for book one, which again, I love, highly recommend. And then here I got a chance to read the rest of the duology, and I'm happy to say, as I mentioned, that this book series, because it has no middle book, has no fat in it. Instead, it is very tight, and while it is a really detailed story, everything in there is so very intentional. The character work is fantastic. I love the main character, and you also get a cast of additional characters that play larger roles in the second book. This second book, as you can imagine, is more similar to the second half of book one, where again it is more focused on the military politics. And so if that is the part of the story that you enjoy and really love, you'll get more of that here. This is a story of rebellion and strife and becoming something that you perhaps are not meant to be, fulfilling a destiny. Lots of beautiful imagery within these books. Now, this is technically historical fantasy, but you should note that there's very little in terms of the fantastical elements. I've heard, and I don't know if it's for sure true, that this book was originally written as a historical fiction, and then perhaps the editor suggested that they bring in some fantastical elements. That might just be hearsay, but it definitely fits the story. So if you're looking for dragons and crazy magic, you're not going to get that. Instead, this book is a lot more light. There are ghosts, there's possibly something magical going on, but it's really more about historical China, which happens to be a time period and place in history that I personally love. And so if you can't tell, really enjoyed this book. Without spoiling anything, the ending is so strong and actually got me pretty emotional, which I didn't expect. Perhaps it's not the most surprising or unexpected ending, but I thought it fit the story just right, and I really loved it. So if you haven't read this series, highly recommend, but you do want to go back to book one and experience it from the start. Next, let's talk about The Water Outlaws by S.L. Huang. And this is another book I received for review. This is the first book in what I'm hoping will be a new series. Right now it's just a standalone, but in this series we follow this great individual, this woman who is a great military talent. This book is also set in historical China, so you're going to see some comparisons between these two books and definitely see a subgenre of fantasy that I personally love. So within the story, she is this great master of the arts of fighting. However, right at the beginning of the story, she is disgraced and goes about going into business, for lack of a better word, with a group of outlaws. So she survives with these other women and they fight along the countryside. Now, this is a piece of fiction that is heavily influenced by the Chinese tradition of martial arts. I know there's a word for that. I do not know how to pronounce it on camera, but essentially it's what shonen has grown into as a manga, kind of comes from these roots. The word starts with a W. Help me out in the comments down below. But regardless, even if I can't pronounce it, I love this style. I have read a fair amount of manga at this point. I have watched a lot more anime anime. I have watched and read different things like The Three Kingdoms and A Hero Borne, so the Heroes of Condor quartet. And so for me, this is a book that I would recommend to those of you like myself who have read and loved the Heroes of Condor quartet and are looking for more. And particularly if you're looking for something that is female bent, because if I didn't say it, the entire group of outlaws are all women. So you have this historical fiction setting where the women are at the forefront of the story, which historically, if you look at a lot of the traditional tales, they're very male-centric. It's just how stories were written those days. If you're going to have characters that are martial artists and the story was written many years ago, well, chances are they're going to be men in those roles. So I love that this is gender bent and gives women at the forefront of the story. Really enjoyed it. Again, the martial arts, the action is all very fun. It's very fast-paced, as you would imagine with a story like this. If I had any criticism, it's just the fact that the characters are perhaps not the forefront of the story. I wouldn't call this a character-focused story, so you're not going to get a lot of development. I don't really know the characters very deeply in terms of their personalities, their wants, their desires. Instead, it's just like watching or reading rather a fictionalized version of a really good martial arts story. And again, if you love things like Heroes of Condor, I really think you'll enjoy this one as well. I hope there is more coming because I would love to read it and highly recommend this one if that is up your alley. If those are things that you enjoy reading about and watching, I think you'll love this one too. Next up is Elder Epoch, which is the third book in the series that starts with the Gunmetal Gods. This is one of my favorite series I read, I believe, last year, and I'm catching up on the newest title that just came out. This is a fantasy that is inspired by the Crusades. It is set in a Middle Eastern setting, and in the first book we follow two characters on polarizing sides of the conflict, and you have two of the most memorable characters in there. I adored book one, and I will admit that I struggled with book two because there is a shift in perspective and it almost felt more like a follow-up novel or companion novel rather than a direct sequel, and so I was a little bit hesitant to continue on, but thankfully the third book is on Kindle Unlimited, which I still have a subscription to, so I checked it out and I'm really glad I did. While I still prefer book one, this one really for me reframes book two because I see it as a larger story. I would say that it has a lot of what I loved from book one and continues on to expand the world, which is what book two did. So you have the new characters, the old characters, and I love the setting, I love the richness. Without sounding too biased, I will say that I do often have preconceptions about the quality of writing that comes with indie published work, and this is some of the best indie published or just professionally published prose that I have read, and I really love what this author's doing. I think the one character particularly I adore. I think that he is just very rich and well-rounded and complex and not flat, and I'm really growing to appreciate the other perspectives as well. So if you have started this series, I do encourage you to continue on. I'm dying for the next book. I would love to keep going with the series as long as it goes, and from my perspective, I would definitely say if you haven't yet started at the beginning, start with Gunmetal Gods, and I do think it's worth the investment. I love the series so much and I can't recommend it enough. Next up is Victory City, which is another historical fantasy. I just realized that pretty much all the fantasy in this video are historical fantasy, which surprises me considering I always say that I don't read historical fiction. Maybe I need to stop saying that. But in the story, this is set in historical India, where we follow a young girl who is destined to raise this great city. This is a book I picked up randomly. It was available through my library via Libby. I checked it out, not knowing much about it, and I haven't heard other reviewers talking about it, but maybe I'm just in the wrong circle. So for me, this is one of the sleeper hits of the year. This is published in 2023, and I would love for more people to check it out. This is just a beautiful piece of historical fiction that explores a time period of India, again, a place that I know very little about historically, and I found that to be very fascinating. The prose is beautiful. It's kind of told in a story where this story is recounted to the reader almost after the fact, and so it reads like this epic tale or this folklore. It feels rich and beautiful. You have this strong female character at the center of the story, and I just had a really good time with the book. It is slow burning, it is very character focused, so don't expect the story to be overly action packed, but for whatever reason this one completely held my attention despite being supposedly not my taste. So highly recommend this one if you're looking for something like this. If you're looking for something, again, that maybe is flying under the radar, this is one that I would love to see more people reading. Next is Dual Memory by Sue Burke. This is another new release that came out earlier this year. I just received a copy for review. In the story, we follow a man who is living in the Arctic. He supposedly is there to fight the ruthless pirates. However, you find out within the story that he is actually spying on the people there. And this is just a really bizarre piece of science fiction that I was really hoping I was going to love based off everything I've heard that's so great about Sue Burke. I still really want to read Semiosis by her. Unfortunately, you can probably tell where this review is going. I love the premise as an idea, and I did not enjoy the execution. I just found this book to be very messy. If you check out the sample on perhaps Kindle, you can kind of see what I mean, that the writing is a little bit distinct. And for me, it was distinct in a way that I did not enjoy. I found it to be a little bit all over the place. It didn't really hold my attention. I found myself really struggling to stay immersed or to care about the characters. And it was just, it didn't work with my brain. So maybe it'll work with someone else's, but this was a big miss for me. I was very unsatisfied by it, and it just didn't work honestly on pretty much any level, which is incredibly disappointing for a book that I've been dying to read when it first came out earlier this year. Next up, we have Exadelic by Jon Evans, and this is another book I received for review. This is a piece of science fiction that is also a thriller. It is set in a future where the military has this offshoot where they rely on artificial intelligence, and within there somehow the AI has hacked the time frame, and they have set out to identify this middle manager at this Silicon Valley firm to be the greatest threat to humanity. So we follow this man as he is on the run from every authority on the books. Now, I picked up this one really hoping that there would be a focus on some of the artificial intelligence and some of the technology surrounding all of this. And I think I was mistaken and should have taken a little bit more time to evaluate this book before requesting it, because while this is technically classified as science fiction, it's one of those stories that is clearly meant to be an action-packed thriller that just so happens to use scientific technology in order to fulfill the story that the author wants to tell. So the science fiction makes no sense. It's really in the background. It's really forgotten about, which is not important to every reader. I love science fiction, so I'm always disappointed when I get a thriller where it teases science fiction then doesn't really go through with that. I do think this book would be better classified and marketed as a straight-up thriller, and so I wouldn't have been as disappointed if I didn't think it was going to have those sci-fi elements, but because it came out from Tor, I had different ideas of what I was getting myself into. Basically, this is a super action-packed driven story with a main character who is immediately introduced and immediately on the run, and because of that, I never really deeply cared for him as a character, and I just didn't have really strong feelings about him or anything that happened to him, and it's just, quite frankly, not the kind of story that I enjoy watching or reading, so I tend to avoid these really action-packed stories. You've heard me say on my channel that I read thrillers, but really what I mean is I read psychological thrillers. Action-based thrillers are not my thing, so this book was just a giant miss. I do imagine that it has an audience because it reminded me a lot of Helldivers, which I read with my patron book club and have discussed over there, and I kind of feel about this book the same way I feel about Helldivers, where it's really action-packed with not a lot of character, and it's really not for me. Next is The Witch and the Tsar, which is a piece of historical fantasy where we follow a character who is Baba Yaga. They are this goddess. They travel to Russia during the time period where Ivan the Terrible was coming into his own. And I was really excited for this one because I'm very fascinated by some of that Slavic or Russian style culture. Baba Yaga as a character is very distinct in a lot of the literature that I read, and I was just curious to pick this one up. So I will say that I love the atmosphere. There's something just very rich about it. The cultural nods to Russia and the time period, one that I'm not particularly incredibly familiar with outside of just some basic films and so forth. I think for me what doesn't work quite as well is the fact that in a book like this you would expect Baba Yaga to have a certain personality, and instead I would say she comes across as very soft and sweet and not the witchy strong personality I would love for her to be. And so I just found her to be a little bit bland, which is disappointing, and the story itself was less interesting than the framework of the world building around it. So needless to say, this book didn't meet my expectations. I thought it was doing some interesting things but didn't quite accomplish what it was setting out to do, which left me wanting more and not in a positive way, unfortunately. Last up, let's talk about Borne by Jeff VanderMeer. And this is a piece of weird science fiction that I picked up because I've always thought that I would really love this book, even though I unfortunately did not love Annihilation. In the story, we follow this salvager named Rachel who explores this place, and on this bear they find this little entity that they call Borne. She goes to take care of it, and slowly we see Borne evolving. Now, this is obviously a piece of weird science fiction. All the stuff with the bear was over my head. I've come to the conclusion that weird science fiction is just not my thing. I think I like the idea of it. I think, oh yeah, of course I would love weird sci-fi. But when it actually comes down to it, I don't love it as much as I wish I did. But I am pleasantly surprised that I still enjoyed this one quite a bit because of the fact that while it has really weird science fiction in it, which I did not love, at the core of the story is this beautiful emotional tale, which is very reminiscent of a relationship between, say, a mother and their child, where you have this woman who is taking care of this young being, watching them grow, and in some ways feeling very helpless as they are not entirely able to protect them, and you just have to kind of have them go their way through life. And so it had some really beautiful imagery and thoughtfulness to the story that actually hit me in the feels. So I could have done without the weird stuff, which is arguably pretty central to the story, but the actual emotional heart of the story did work for me, and I'm really pleased to say that. So I don't think I'll read everything that Jeff VanderMeer has written, but this is one that I did enjoy, and I would recommend to those of you, even if you're like me and don't think that you enjoy weird science fiction, if you want a kooky story with a lot of heart and emotion behind it, this is one you still might enjoy. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning to read and which ones are you planning to skip? For whatever reason, I had a much better time with fantasy this time around. I always say that I'm a science fiction reader first and foremost, but if you've watched my reviews this year, I am really warming up to fantasy. So please let me know if that's going to be an issue in the comments, or don't let me know. Hopefully you'll come along with my reading journey, as again, my taste ebbs and flows. I go through stages where all I want to read is sci-fi, and then all I want to read is fantasy, and then I skip over to horror for a bit. And I appreciate those of you that stick around through all of this. If you're new to my channel and do want to stick around for that hot mess, I appreciate if you stick around and subscribe. You can help me out with this video with a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just something to represent historical fantasy. Find something creative in there, maybe a sword or martial art hands. Is that a thing? I don't know. Look in the emojis and figure something out. I'm not creative there. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.